Sometime in the mid-1960s, an elderly man walked into a McDonald's restaurant on South Willow Street in Manchester, New Hampshire. He brought his step-grandson. The boy expected something special. After all, his grandfather had started the whole thing, built the system, named the company, designed the golden arches. But there was no VIP treatment, no manager rushing over, no free meal. The old man stood in line behind everyone else, ordered at the counter, and paid full price. The boy was embarrassed. His grandfather just smiled. The man's name was Richard McDonald, and almost nobody in that restaurant had any idea who he was. This is the story of two brothers from New Hampshire who invented fast food. They created a system so efficient it changed how the entire world eats. Then they sold it for $2.7 million to a milkshake machine salesman who spent the next 2 decades erasing them from history. When Ray Kroc died in 1984, his fortune was worth $600 million. He left behind a 554-acre ranch near Santa Barbara where the Egg McMuffin was invented, a professional baseball team, and a legacy as the founder of McDonald's. Richard McDonald left behind a 3-bedroom house in Bedford, New Hampshire, and an estate worth $1.8 million. The story begins not in California, but in a shoe factory in Manchester, New Hampshire. And it begins with a father who gave 42 years of his life to a company that gave him nothing in return. Chapter 1. The Man Who Had to Pay for His Own Burger. Richard McDonald never liked California. He said so himself years after leaving. Cloudy days made him happy. Sunshine did not. So when the restaurant business was finished and there was nothing left to stay for, he went home. Back to New Hampshire. Back to the town where he and his brother Maurice had grown up poor, the sons of an Irish immigrant who worked the shoe factory floor for 4 decades. Dick settled in Bedford, a quiet suburb of Manchester, and married Dorothy Jones. The house was modest, 3 bedrooms. Nothing that would suggest the man living inside had once operated the most talked-about restaurant in America. He kept a low profile. No interviews unless someone tracked him down. No appearances at McDonald's corporate events. No seat on any board. The company that carried his name had written him out of the story entirely. Ray Kroc's autobiography described the Des Plaines, Illinois franchise as the original McDonald's. Plaques with Kroc's face hung in restaurants across the country, crediting him with the vision, the persistence, and the leadership that built the empire. Richard and Maurice were not mentioned. Then, in 1964, a McDonald's opened on South Willow Street in Manchester. It was the 596th franchise. It sat roughly a block from the house where Dick and Mac had grown up. Dick took his step-grandson there one afternoon. The boy assumed his grandfather would be treated like royalty. Instead, they stood in line. They ordered. They paid. Nobody looked twice at the old man in front of them. The boy lost a lot of respect for his grandfather that day. Dick apparently did not mind. A reporter once asked him whether he regretted selling, whether it stung to watch Kroc build a global empire on the system he and his brother had invented. Dick said no. If he had held on, he said, he would have wound up in some skyscraper somewhere with 4 ulcers and 8 tax attorneys trying to figure out how to pay his income tax. It was a good line, the kind of answer that closes a conversation. But his nephew, who was actually named Ronald McDonald, told a different version of the story. He said Mac took the deal hard, that he watched his uncle being torn apart by what happened until the day he died. The truth, as usual, was probably somewhere between the two. Chapter 2. Fired after 42 years. Patrick James McDonald came to the United States from Ireland as a child. He settled in Manchester, New Hampshire, a mill city along the Merrimack River, where thousands of Irish Catholic families had clustered around the textile and shoe factories that powered the local economy. Patrick found work at the G.P. Crafts shoe factory and stayed. He showed up before dawn, followed every instruction, and never caused trouble. Over time, he rose to shift manager, overseeing part of a workforce that numbered around 20,000. He married Margaret Curran, who had made the same crossing as a girl. They raised 5 children in a working-class neighborhood. Maurice, the eldest son, was born in 1902. Richard arrived 7 years later. 3 sisters followed. The family attended Catholic church. The boys went to local schools. Mac enrolled at Central High, Dick at West High. In the same classrooms, remarkably, sat the Revson brothers, who would go on to found the cosmetics empire Revlon. Manchester was producing ambitious sons, even if the city itself offered them very little. Patrick never earned much, but he had stability. 42 years at the same factory. He expected that loyalty would count for something when he got older. A pension, a handshake, some acknowledgement that he had given the best decades of his life to the company. What he got was a dismissal. The factory told him he was too old. No severance, no pension, no ceremony. After more than 4 decades of showing up every morning, Patrick McDonald walked out with nothing. His sons watched it happen, and it changed them. Dick later told an interviewer that he and Mac made up their minds right then. One way or another, they would be financially independent. They would never rely on someone else's paycheck. They set a target, $1 million before they turned 50. It was an enormous sum for 2 young men with no education, no connections, and no capital. But they had seen what happened to a man who played by the rules and trusted his employer. That was enough. In the late 1920s, with the shoe factories beginning to slow and Manchester offering nothing but more of the same, the brothers packed up and headed for California. They had heard the movie business was booming. They figured they would start there. Chapter 3: The Barbecue Stand on Route 66. The movie business did not work out. Mac and Dick found work as stagehands at film studios around Hollywood, earning little. They saved what they could and bought a movie theater in Glendora, a small town east of Los Angeles. The Depression made sure it never turned a profit. After several years of losses, they sold the theater and looked for something else. Their father, Patrick, the man who had been thrown out of the shoe factory with nothing, joined them for the next venture. Together, they opened a hot dog stand near the Santa Anita racetrack in Monrovia in 1937. It did fine during racing season. When the horses left, so did the customers. The stand went quiet. Maurice, the more restless of the 2 brothers, wanted to think bigger. He had noticed San Bernardino, a large working-class city, roughly 50 miles east, with a steady stream of traffic and no shortage of hungry drivers. In 1940, the brothers secured a loan, scraped together what reportedly amounted to $5,000 in capital, and opened McDonald's Bar B Quay at the corner of 14th and E Streets. The location sat about a mile south of Route 66. The menu had 25 items. Young women in uniforms served customers in their cars. The place did well, but the model was breaking down in ways that the revenue masked. The car hop girls spent more time flirting with customers than delivering food, which slowed service and inflated tips that cut into margins. Dishes and silverware disappeared or shattered constantly. Teenagers had turned drive-ins across America into hangouts, and families, the customers Dick and Mac actually wanted, were starting to stay away. Then Dick sat down with the books and found something that reframed everything. Roughly 80% of their sales came from one item: hamburgers, the barbecue ribs, the pulled pork, the elaborate sandwiches. Almost nobody ordered them. The brothers were running a complex kitchen to serve food that barely moved. Mac and Dick made a decision that everyone around them thought was insane. They would shut the restaurant down entirely, fire every car hop, gut the kitchen, throw out the dishes, the silverware, the entire 25-item menu, and reopen as something that did not yet have a name. Chapter 4: The Kitchen They Drew in Chalk. They closed in October of 1948. For 3 months, the restaurant on 14th and E Street sat dark. The brothers ripped out everything: the barbecue pit, the plates, the silverware. When they were done stripping the kitchen bare, they needed to figure out how to rebuild it. Dick had an idea. Behind their house was a tennis court. One afternoon, he walked out with a piece of chalk and started drawing. Not a sketch on paper, a full-scale layout, life-sized, right there on the court surface. Every grill, every counter, every station where a worker would stand. He drew it all in chalk and then called the employees out to test it. They walked through the motions. One man pretended to work the grill, another wrapped burgers, a third operated the fryer. They moved through the layout, doing their jobs in pantomime, and kept bumping into each other. Dick erased the lines and redrew them. They tested it again, adjusted again. That night, a rainstorm rolled through and washed the entire layout off the court. The next morning, they came back and did it all over again. What emerged from that tennis court was something the restaurant industry had never seen. Dick and Matt called it the Speedy Service System. 9 items on the menu. Hamburgers at 15 cents. No plates, no silverware, no waitresses. Customers walked up to a window, ordered and received their food in paper wrappers within 30 seconds. The kitchen operated like a factory floor. Each worker had one task. One man grilled, one dressed buns, one ran the fryer. The brothers had taken Henry Ford's assembly line and applied it to food. The first months were rough. Regular customers pulled up expecting car hops and found a window. Some drove away. Former employees who had been let go stood across the street and heckled. But gradually, a different crowd arrived. Families who wanted a cheap meal without a long wait. Drivers who needed to eat fast and get back on the road. The 15-cent hamburger was impossible to ignore. By the early 1950s, the restaurant was pulling lines down the block. Dick, who had a flair for the visual, wanted a building to match the system. In 1952, the brothers hired architect Stanley Clark Meston and his assistant Charles Fish. They went back to the tennis court with chalk one more time, mapping out equipment dimensions for the architect. Meston designed a building that stopped traffic. Red and white ceramic tile, stainless steel surfaces, pulsing neon, and 2 25-foot yellow sheet metal arches that cut through the roofline. Meston hated the arches. He reportedly told the brothers not to tell anyone he was involved. Dick insisted they stay. The first franchise opened in Phoenix, Arizona in 1953. A gasoline distributor named Neil Fox paid a flat fee of $1,000 for the rights. The second went to Fox's brother-in-law in Downey, California. That Downey restaurant is still standing. It is the oldest McDonald's in the world. The brothers had built something that worked. They just did not yet know that a 52-year-old milkshake machine salesman in Illinois had noticed. Chapter 5: The Milkshake Machine Salesman. Raymond Kroc had been failing for most of his adult life. Not dramatically, not in any single catastrophic moment. Just a long, slow grind of jobs that never quite led anywhere. He was born in Oak Park, Illinois in 1902, the same year as Maurice McDonald, though the two would not meet for another half-century. His parents were Czech immigrants. His father, Alois, made a fortune in land speculation during the 20s and lost it all in the crash of '29. The lesson young Ray took from that was not caution. It was speed. If money could vanish overnight, you had to move fast while it was still there. He dropped out of school at 15 and lied about his age to join the Red Cross as an ambulance driver during the First World War. In training, he was assigned alongside another teenager who had done the same thing. That boy was Walt Disney. The war ended before either of them saw real action. Back home, Kroc drifted. He played piano in jazz bands and on a Chicago radio station. He tried selling real estate in Florida during the land boom and came back broke when the bubble burst. He spent years selling paper cups for the Lily Tulip Cup Company, eventually rising to Midwestern sales manager. It was steady work. It was also a dead end. Then, in the late 1930s, he came across a device that fascinated him. The multi-mixer was a commercial machine that could produce 5 milkshakes at once. Kroc saw a future in it. He left the security of Lily Tulip and staked his career on selling multi-mixers to soda fountains and restaurants across the country. For a while, it worked. By the early 50s, it was not working anymore. Cheaper competitors from Hamilton Beach were eating into his sales. Restaurants were buying fewer machines. Kroc was 52 years old, deeply in debt, and running out of road. Then an order came in that made no sense. A single hamburger restaurant in San Bernardino, California, wanted 8 multi-mixers, 8 machines, 40 milkshakes at a time. No restaurant Kroc had ever visited needed that kind of capacity. He went to California to see for himself. What he found when he arrived was a line of customers stretching around the building. Families, working people. All of them served almost immediately, all of them eating the same thing. No confusion, no delays, No wasted motion. The kitchen was visible through the windows, and it moved like nothing Kroc had ever seen. He stood there watching for a long time, and he knew. Chapter 6. The Deal the Brothers Should Never Have Made. Kroc came back to San Bernardino with a proposal. He wanted to franchise McDonald's across the entire country. He would handle the expansion, the recruiting, the site selection, the training. The brothers would not have to do anything except collect their share. Dick and Mac were skeptical. They had already sold a handful of franchises on their own, and the experience had not been encouraging. Quality was hard to control at a distance. They worried that the self-service model might not work in colder climates, where customers would not want to stand outside at a window. And the truth was, they were comfortable. The restaurant was making good money. They had a house. They had the system. They did not need Ray Kroc. But Kroc was a salesman. He had spent his entire career learning how to make people say yes, and what he offered sounded reasonable. The brothers would retain ownership of the brand. Kroc would take 1.9% of each franchise's gross sales, out of which the brothers would receive 0.5%. It seemed like free money. Someone else would do the work. They would get a cut. What the brothers did not fully grasp was what those percentages would mean once the numbers started multiplying. 1.9% of one restaurant was nothing. 1.9% of 1,000 restaurants was a fortune. And Kroc was not thinking about 10 or 20 locations. He was thinking about every city in America. In April of 1955, Kroc opened his first McDonald's in Des Plaines, Illinois, just outside Chicago. He was obsessive from the start. Every franchise had to look the same. Every burger had to be prepared the same way. The fries had to be the same length, cooked at the same temperature, served in the same container. Kroc did not want restaurants. He wanted replicas. By 1959, there were over 100 McDonald's locations in the United States. Kroc had established a system of training so rigorous that in 1961, he formalized it into a program he called Hamburger University, based in the basement of a restaurant in Elk Grove Village, Illinois. Franchisees attended courses on operations, quality control, and the precise methods that Kroc demanded. Graduates received what the company called a degree in hamburgerology. The brothers watched all of this from California. They had not moved. They had not hired staff to oversee the expansion. They simply cashed the checks that arrived from Kroc's operation. It was, by any measure, a good arrangement. But Kroc was not satisfied. The more restaurants he opened, the more he resented the contract. The brothers had veto power over changes to the system, and they used it. Kroc could not alter the menu. He could not modify the building design. He could not modify a single building or shortcut a single procedure without written approval from two men in California who did not share his urgency. The partnership that had looked so clean on paper was starting to crack. Chapter 7, 2.7 million and a handshake. By 1960, the numbers told a story that made Ray Kroc sick. His net profit for the year, after all expenses, was $77,000. The McDonald brothers, operating their single restaurant in California, cleared over $100,000. Kroc had opened hundreds of locations. He had spent years on the road, negotiating leases, recruiting franchisees, enforcing standards down to the thickness of a pickle slice. And the two men who stayed home and did nothing were making more than he was. The problem was structural. Kroc earned a percentage of sales, but his costs were enormous. The brothers earned a smaller percentage of those same sales, but their costs were nearly zero. The harder Kroc worked, the wider the gap felt. His financial strategist, Harry Sonneborn, offered a solution that went beyond the restaurant business entirely. Sonneborn created the Franchise Realty Corporation. Instead of simply licensing the McDonald's name, the company would buy the land underneath each new restaurant and lease it back to the franchisee. The rent would be tied to sales. If a franchise did well, McDonald's earned more. If it failed, the company still owned the property. It was a real estate model wrapped inside a fast food brand, and it changed everything. McDonald's was no longer just selling hamburgers. It was accumulating land across the United States. With this new engine running, Kroc wanted the brothers gone. He offered to buy them out. The brothers talked it over and came back with a number, $2.7 million. The figure was calculated precisely. After taxes, each brother would walk away with $1 million. The promise they had made as young men, standing in the shadow of their father's humiliation, would finally be kept. Kroc reportedly called the amount outrageous, but Sonneborn found the money. The interest on the loans would eventually push the true cost to $14 million. At the closing, one detail sent Kroc into a fury. The brothers intended to keep the original restaurant. They were not handing over the building or the land. They told Kroc the property would go to their longtime employees. Kroc later said the brothers had blindsided him with this, though the brothers maintained they had been transparent from the start. Stripped of the McDonald's name, Dick and Mac reopened their restaurant as the Big M. They kept the golden arches on the sign. Sharpened into the shape of a giant letter, M. Kroc's response was immediate and personal. He opened a brand new McDonald's just blocks from the Big M. Two restaurants selling the same food on the same street, but only one of them had the name. The Big M could not compete. It closed within 6 years. The original building was torn down in 1971. The site where the brothers had invented fast food became a parking lot, and then eventually a small museum operated by a local restaurant chain. The brothers had their $1 million each. They had kept the promise. But the name on the building, the system in the kitchen, and the arches on the highway all belonged to someone else now. Chapter 8. The ranch they called the Hamburger. In 1966, 5 years after taking full control of McDonald's, Kroc purchased a sprawling property near Santa Barbara for $600,000. He named it the J&R Double Arch Ranch after himself and his third wife, Joan, and began turning it into something that was half home, half corporate headquarters. Joan had entered his life in 1957. They met when she was playing organ at a restaurant in St. Paul, Minnesota. Both were married to other people at the time. They reconnected at a McDonald's conference in 1969. That same year, Kroc married her in front of a massive stone fireplace inside the ranch's main lodge. The fireplace required 120 tons of native stone quarried from the estate itself. The lodge was enormous, 17,000 square feet, more than 20 bedroom suites, a dining room that could seat over 100 guests, a great room with a 28-foot ceiling, carved wooden beams, and glass walls looking out across the valley. It was not a family home. It was a facility designed for business retreats where Kroc could host franchisees, test ideas, and remind everyone who was in charge. And he used it constantly. Franchisees were invited for weekend gatherings. Executives spent days at the property reviewing performance numbers and debating strategy. In the years before his retirement in the early 70s, the Double Arch Ranch functioned as the true operational center of McDonald's, the place where decisions were made before they reached the boardroom in Illinois. Kroc did not run his empire from a corner office. He ran it from a valley in the middle of California. The most important room on the grounds was the test kitchen. Commercial grade, built to replicate actual franchise conditions, with metal instruction plates above the stoves showing exact cooking times for every menu item. This was where McDonald's developed some of its most profitable innovations. The Egg McMuffin was conceived here. Other major menu items reportedly followed. Kroc and his team would cook, taste, argue, adjust, and cook again until a product was ready to roll out to thousands of locations at once. Adjacent to the lodge sat a conference hall with theater-style seating for 65. South of that, a library building with bookshelves lining the walls and 5 bedrooms for guests who stayed to work. Kroc's brother Robert, a zoologist and philanthropist, had a separate 3-bedroom cottage on the property where he conducted research and oversaw the Kroc Foundation. But the most unusual structure sat on a hilltop above everything else. In 1972, Kroc built a circular house for Joan. One large round room with a central fire pit, a tiki bar, and floor-to-ceiling glass offering 360-degree views of the Santa Ynez Valley. Joan hosted events and private dinners in the roundhouse while the lodge handled the corporate crowds. Locals had a name for the building. They called it the Hamburger. The ranch eventually listed for $29 million after passing through one subsequent owner. It never sold at that price. But for the years Kroc occupied it, the Double Arch Ranch was the nerve center of the empire that bore another family's name. Chapter 9: The Brother Who Died of a Broken Deal. After the sale closed in 1961, the two brothers went in different directions. Dick eventually returned to New Hampshire. Mac stayed in California. He had lived there for over 30 years, and unlike his brother, he did not feel the pull of Manchester or the cold New England winters. He settled in Palm Springs, a desert city popular with retirees and Hollywood types, and lived quietly. There was no second act, no new business, no consulting role with the company that still carried his name. Mac simply stopped. He was 59 years old, financially comfortable for the first time in his life, and completely disconnected from the thing he had spent 2 decades building. Meanwhile, that thing was becoming something neither brother could have imagined. In the early 1960s, McDonald's retired the Speedy mascot, the little chef with a hamburger for a head that Dick had helped create, and replaced him with a clown named Ronald McDonald. The brother's nephew, who was actually named Ronald McDonald, now shared his name with a fictional character selling hamburgers to children on television. Nobody at the corporation seemed to notice or care about the coincidence. In 1968, the Big Mac was added to the national menu. It reportedly became the chain's best-selling item after French fries. By the early 1970s, McDonald's had thousands of locations across the United States and was pushing into international markets. The company was on its way to becoming the most recognized commercial brand on the planet. And Ray Kroc was making sure the world knew who deserved the credit. His autobiography presented the story as if it began with him. The Des Plaines franchise, the one Kroc had opened in 1955, was designated as the original McDonald's and eventually turned into a museum. Plaques with Kroc's likeness were mounted on the walls of restaurants across the country. The inscription credited him with the vision, the persistence, and the leadership that built the chain. Richard and Maurice McDonald were not mentioned. Mac watched all of this from Palm Springs. He read the newspaper articles. He saw the television commercials. He heard Kroc described as the founder of the company that bore his family's name. The money from the sale had been good. $1 million after taxes was a genuine fortune in 1961. But money, it turned out, was not the thing that mattered most to Maurice McDonald. Recognition did. Or rather, the complete absence of it. Those who knew Mac in his final years described a man who could not let go of what had happened. He did not rage publicly or take legal action. He simply carried it. The resentment, the sense of being written out of his own story, the awareness that every new restaurant opening was a reminder of what he had given up. His nephew later said that watching what the deal did to Mac was like watching someone slowly come apart from the inside. Maurice McDonald died of heart failure at his desert home on December 11, 1971. He was 69 years old. He was buried at Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, California, a short drive from where he had spent his last decade in near total obscurity. At the time of his death, there were thousands of McDonald's restaurants in operation. Not one of them carried any reference to the man who had helped invent the system that made them possible. Chapter 10: 4 Ulcers and 8 Tax Attorneys. Ray Kroc bought the San Diego Padres baseball team in 1974 for $12 million, mostly because he was bored and had always loved the game. At the season opener, he grabbed the public address microphone and told 39,000 fans he had never seen such stupid ball playing. It was classic Kroc. He ran everything the way he ran McDonald's. Loudly, personally, and with total conviction that he knew best. His health declined through the late 70s. A stroke in 1980 led to a stay in alcohol rehabilitation. On January 14, 1984, Kroc died of heart failure in San Diego. He was 81. McDonald's had over 7,500 locations and was generating billions in annual sales. Joan Kroc inherited it all. Over the next 2 decades, she gave nearly every dollar away. $100 million to expand the Ronald McDonald House charity. $25 million to a peace institute at the University of San Diego. When she died of brain cancer in 2003, her will included $1.5 billion to the Salvation Army for community centers across America and more than $200 million to National Public Radio. It was the largest single charitable bequest ever recorded at that time. The fortune that Ray Kroc had built on a system invented by two brothers from New Hampshire ended up funding swimming pools, skating rinks, and after-school programs in low-income neighborhoods across the country. Dick McDonald outlived them all. He kept to himself in New Hampshire for nearly 4 decades after the sale, watching from a distance as the company became the most recognized brand on earth. He never sought attention. He never filed a lawsuit. He gave occasional interviews when reporters found him, always polite, always brief, always deflecting any bitterness with that same line about ulcers and tax attorneys. He died on July 14, 1998, in a nursing home in Manchester, the same city where he had been born 89 years earlier, the same city where his father had been fired from the shoe factory with nothing. His wife Dorothy passed away 6 months later. They were buried beside each other at Mount Calvary Cemetery in Manchester. Today, McDonald's operates over 40,000 restaurants in more than 100 countries. The company serves tens of millions of customers every single day. It owns 70% of its restaurant buildings and 45% of the land beneath them, making it one of the largest commercial real estate operations on the planet. The original San Bernardino site is a small museum. The Downey franchise from 1953 is still serving customers. The film The Founder, released in 2016, with Michael Keaton playing Ray Kroc, introduced the brothers' story to a generation that had never heard it. For most viewers, it was the first time they learned that McDonald's had not been founded by the man whose face once hung in every restaurant. Dick McDonald's estate was valued at $1.8 million. The company that carries his name is worth hundreds of billions. Chapter 11. The Ending. There is a version of this story where the McDonald brothers are the villains of their own downfall. Two men who had the golden ticket and traded it for pocket change, who lacked ambition, who could not see what was right in front of them. But that version only works if you believe that building an empire is the only definition of success. Dick and Mac McDonald did not set out to change the world. They set out to keep a promise. Two sons of an immigrant who was discarded after a lifetime of loyalty wanted to prove that they could stand on their own. $1 million each. That was the number. When the check cleared in 1961, the promise was kept. By their own measure, they had won. The problem is that someone else won bigger, incomparably bigger. And he did it using their name, their system, and their invention, while methodically removing them from the record. That is the part of the story that is harder to make peace with. Not the money, the erasure. There is a disputed claim that during the buyout negotiations, Kroc verbally agreed to continue paying the brothers a perpetual 0.5% royalty on all future sales. The brothers reportedly trusted the handshake and never had it written into the contract. Kroc denied the agreement ever existed. Whether or not that conversation took place, the math is worth considering. McDonald's current system-wide sales exceed $130 billion annually. 0.5% of that figure is $650 million every year. The brothers sold their company for less than what a single year's royalty would now generate. Mac could not live with it. Dick claimed he could. One died at 69 in a desert retirement town, reportedly hollowed out by regret. The other lived to 89 in a small house in the town where he was born, insisting to anyone who asked that he had no complaints. Perhaps Dick was telling the truth. Or perhaps repeating it often enough was the only way to make it bearable. What is not in dispute is what the brothers left behind. Before Dick McDonald drew a kitchen layout in chalk on a tennis court, there was no fast food industry. There were diners and drive-ins and lunch counters, but there was no system designed to deliver a consistent product at volume and speed to millions of people simultaneously. That system now feeds millions of human beings every day across more than 100 countries. It did not come from a boardroom or a business school. It came from two brothers with a piece of chalk and a problem to solve. The golden arches are visible from nearly every highway in America. The name McDonald is printed on bags and wrappers and buildings in languages the brothers never spoke. But in Manchester, New Hampshire, at the cemetery on the hill, the gravestone carries no title, no slogan, no trademark, just a name. If you found this story worth your time, please consider subscribing. We tell these kinds of stories every week.